Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Sons of Antiquity podcast. You thought we were a dead channel, didn't you? Well, the joke's on you. We're back, and even more mature and suave than before. In case you hadn't heard, a certain orange man has recently reclaimed the throne to rid us of democracy forever. All jesting aside, though, we must ask, does someone like Trump have a historical precedent, even in America? The answer may shock you.
Despite all their differences, we will attempt to show you that the similarities between Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson are quite compelling. In view of these, we will discuss what we can possibly expect from a second Trump presidency, and we can take solace knowing that our nation has gone through times like these before. So let's begin.
One glowing similarity is how each man survived multiple assassination attempts. In 1833, Jackson was assaulted by a man who had been fired for embezzlement, but this only gave him minor injuries. The second assassination attempt, however, in 1835, very nearly ended his life. The assassin brought two loaded pistols. He got close to Jackson, fired the first one, but it misfired. And then he fired the second one, which also misfired. Jackson then beat him with a cane until he was restrained. Once the man was apprehended, the authorities tested both pistols and both fired seamlessly. As for Trump, he was infamously shot on July 13, 2024, where a last-second turn of his head caused the bullet to only hit his ear instead of his skull. A second suspect was found on his property with a rifle, but this was stopped before shots were fired. Both men attributed their survival to direct divine intervention and used it as fuel to accuse their opponents of violent rhetoric.
Secondly, both men seriously alleged that an election was stolen from them. In 1824, Jackson ran in a crowded field against three others who also won electoral votes. Jackson won a plurality of the electoral vote and the popular vote, but since he didn't have a majority, the House chose John Quincy Adams instead. Jackson was anti-establishment, so the House saw Adams as a safer pick. Since Jackson's enemy Henry Clay was appointed Adams' Secretary of State soon after, Jackson considered the election to be a, quote, corrupt bargain. Similarly, Trump alleged that widespread voter fraud caused him to lose in key states in 2020. He has regularly referred to the election as stolen.
Another parallel is their being harsh to a minority group and deporting them. Jackson advocated and oversaw the forced migration of all Indians to lands west of the Appalachians. This was a brutal process where a large portion of the natives died en route, or is it en route? Trump ran on a border wall from the beginning and has promised to deport all illegal immigrants during his second term.
Both men were decried as the end of democracy by their opponents. Jackson was called King Andrew by his enemies for his audacity to veto bills. And Trump was routinely called a fascist and Nazi for pushing for ideas which were mainstream only 10 or 20 years ago. But I suspect democracy will be as intact when Trump is through as it was when Jackson left the White House.
Jackson and Trump appealed to the country more than the cities and the merchant class. If you see these maps, you'll notice that their opponents are strongest in urban centers. In Trump's case, it is even more prominent. It is a red sea with a few blue islands and blue coasts.
Both men relied heavily on populism and promised to take on the establishment. For Jackson, the Bank of the United States was the epitome of politicians and economic interests colluding to swindle the American people. Trump has routinely referred to D.C. as the swamp, which he vows to drain. While he didn't really do that in his first term, things are looking promising this time around.
Another resemblance is the booming economy which occurred under them, and in a way, both deregulated the economy. Jackson gave the national banks money to the state banks, which had fewer rules on loans, and Trump devoted himself to cutting 3 regulations for every new one. Unfortunately for Jackson's successor, Van Buren, this new setup blew up during his time in the Oval Office. We will see if something similar happens during a Vance presidency.
While Jackson didn't really care for tariffs, he enforced the Tariff of Abominations, which caused South Carolina to almost secede for the first time. The tariff was passed to help northern manufacturing, but drove up prices for the struggling southern planters. Jackson threatened war against South Carolina, but ultimately pushed for a lower tariff as a compromise measure. Going into his second term, Trump has strongly advocated for high tariffs, especially against hostile nations, both as a way to generate tax revenue and bring jobs back to the states.
Jackson was revolutionary in his use of the civil service. He replaced many longtime bureaucrats with his loyalists and those who had helped him win. This became known as the spoils system, as in, to the victor goes the spoils. He justified it as a way to remove corruption and keep people from being lifelong bureaucrats. Likewise, Trump promoted many unqualified people into major roles. A clear example of this was Ben Carson for the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Besides being urban himself, his only experience was as a surgeon and candidate for president. Also, Rex Tillerson comes to mind. Before becoming Secretary of State, he was just CEO of ExxonMobil and other oil groups.
Both men were in an irregular marriage situation. Jackson stole another man's wife, and they began living together before the first marriage was even legally ended. This caused him a lot of pain later, and the accusations against his wife, at least partially, led to her demise right after Jackson won the election.
I'm sorry, Miss Jackson.
Trump, rather infamously, cheated on his first wife Ivana and married the adulteress Marla. They divorced later on, and Trump is now married to his third wife, Melania. However, in our more secular culture, this hasn't hurt him that much, once he convinced evangelicals that he was worth supporting.
Jackson and Trump both totally transformed their party through their sheer personality and force. Jackson was a firecracker who took part in numerous duels and worked his way through the military and politics through force of will and boldness. Trump is also, controversial on social media. Jackson helped build the Democratic Party and was its first president. He shut down the bank, he got Indians removed, humiliated South Carolina, and countless other actions during his tenure. Trump took the Republican Party from pro-business, foreign interventionist, and limited government to protective tariffs, anti-globalist, and strong executive. Thank you, Trump. Very cool.
The reputations of Jackson and Trump will be absolutely wrecked by progressive historians in perpetuity. To progressives and even much of the wider public since the 1960s, Jackson has been portrayed as a genocidal tyrant for his treatment of the Indians and their forced relocation away from their ancestral lands. He was also a slave owner and a promoter of the institution. Trump has been called a racist, sexist, homophobe, transphobe, white nationalist, Nazi, insurrectionist, and so much more. I have a feeling he will not be portrayed well in the history books, even if he is wildly successful in his second term.
Their vice presidents were both considered traitors by the end of their first terms, and both presidents opted for a new running mate on the second win. Jackson's vice president, John Calhoun, sided with the nullifiers in South Carolina and became a sworn enemy of Jackson after the event. Mike Pence did not side with Trump's claims of a stolen election and certified the election on January 6th as the Capitol was stormed by an angry mob. Jackson picked loyalist Martin Van Buren and Trump picked J.D. Vance. Just as Van Buren became president after Jackson, I suspect that Vance will be the one to succeed Trump.
Speaking of, their cabinets in their first terms were tumultuous. Jackson fired most of his cabinet due to personal animosity towards one of their wives, and different opinions on some key issues. But in his second term, it was filled with loyalists. Trump's first cabinet had almost no survivors as well. Most were either fired or quit.
Remember Anthony Scaramucci? Yeah, me neither.
This time around, Trump has surrounded himself with people who owe their success to him or have been loyal to him from the beginning.
Last but not least, 2 terms. They won with a higher margin of victory than was suspected by the opposition.
Well, there you have it. Those are the reasons we came up with to justify our opinion that Trump is the Jackson of our time. But as you may be screaming at the screen right now, aren't there some major differences? Why, yes, of course.
Jackson grew up in abject poverty while Trump grew up in luxury. Jackson was born in the boondocks of the Carolinas and his parents died when he was young. He had to fight for himself all of his life. Trump was born into a rich family where he got a lot of loans and inheritance from his father.
It has not been easy for me. And, I started off in Brooklyn. My father gave me a small loan of $1 million,
Jackson was a Southerner, while Trump is a New Yorker. Jackson grew up in the Carolinas, fought in the South, and settled in Tennessee. Trump was born and raised in New York, although he currently lives in Florida.
Jackson became famous through military service, while Trump evaded service. Jackson became a major general through his service against the Indians, Spanish, and British. Even though there were a few blotches on his record, such as executions and human rights abuses, he was famous nationally by the time he won the Battle of New Orleans. Trump, on the other hand, got out of the draft through his claim that he had bone spurs.
Finally, Jackson's life was shaped by honor, and he would do whatever it took to maintain and defend it. Trump, meanwhile, regularly engages in dishonorable acts, especially over Twitter and against women. But different times produce different men. What can you say?
We sincerely hope you enjoyed this comparison video. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and have a fantastic 2025. See you next year! And by that I mean 2026. You think we're gonna make a video this year? Come on, man.
Come on, folks.